In 2006, the Preservation Society of Newport County raised admission prices to Marble House for the third time in a decade. Visitors still came, moving through rooms that once held the weight of American empire. They stood beneath gilded ceilings and photographed fireplaces, shipped stone by stone from French chateaux. But the house had long ago stopped being what it was built to be. It was no longer a home, no longer a seat of power, no longer even a symbol anyone feared. It had become a museum of its own failure. Marble House was completed in 1892 with a single absolute purpose: to prove that Alva Vanderbilt belonged at the center of American society, that new money could purchase not just comfort but legitimacy, that a fortune made in railroads could be laundered into something resembling aristocracy. For a brief, violent moment, it worked. The house became a theater of dominance, a place where the rules of entry were dictated by one woman's will. But the performance could not hold. The money that built Marble House was never designed to sustain institutions. It was designed to announce arrival. And once that announcement had been made, the structure beneath it began to fracture. What remains is not a dynasty, it is evidence. The divorce was announced in March 1895, less than 3 years after Marble House had opened. The settlement was handled quietly, but the terms were explicit. Alva Vanderbilt would retain ownership of the Newport estate. William Kissam Vanderbilt would keep the chateau on Fifth Avenue and most of the liquid assets. The division was not sentimental, it was structural. Marble House had cost over $500,000 to build, roughly $15 million in contemporary terms, and it had been constructed under Alva's direction, financed by William's inheritance. Now it was hers entirely. The building had been designed to secure her position within American society. The divorce confirmed that it had succeeded. The marriage had lasted 18 years. It had produced 3 children and positioned Alva at the center of New York's social architecture. But by 1895, the arrangement had become unsustainable. William had taken a mistress. Alva had taken control of the family's public image. The Vanderbilt name carried weight, but it was Alva who understood how to deploy it. She had used Marble House to force recognition from Mrs. Astor and the old Knickerbocker families who had treated the Vanderbilts as industrialists, with no claim to refinement. The house had worked. The marriage had not. The divorce allowed her to separate the two. Under New York law, divorce required proof of adultery. Alva provided it. William did not contest the terms. The settlement gave her Marble House, an annual income, and the freedom to remarry without losing access to Vanderbilt wealth. She kept the social infrastructure she had built. He kept the liquidity and the family business interests. The transaction was efficient. It treated the marriage as a partnership that had fulfilled its function and could now be dissolved without destroying the assets it had generated. What made the divorce unusual was not the separation itself. Wealthy Americans had been quietly ending marriages for decades, but the fact that Alva retained her position afterward. She did not retreat. She did not remarry quietly. Within 2 years, she would marry Oliver Belmont, another industrialist with a Newport estate, and she would continue to orchestrate social events, political causes, and dynastic marriages for her children. The divorce did not diminish her authority. If anything, it clarified it. She had never needed William's name to hold power. She had needed his money to buy the tools that generated power. Marble House was one of those tools, and now it was hers without condition. The house itself had been occupied for less than a decade. Construction had begun in 1888, and it had opened in August 1892 with a ball that redefined Newport's social calendar. Alva had modeled the building on the Petit Trianon at Versailles, and she had hired Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who had already designed the Vanderbilt Chateau in Manhattan, to execute the plan. The result was a structure that looked older than it was, more European than American, more permanent than the fortune that built it. The exterior was white marble. The interiors were gold leaf, bronze, and imported stone. Every detail had been calculated to suggest inevitability, as though the house had always existed and the Vanderbilts had simply inherited it. But the divorce exposed the house's actual function. It was not a family seat. It was not designed to be passed down through generations. It was an instrument of legitimacy, built to compel recognition from a social class that did not accept industrial wealth as equivalent to inherited status. Once that recognition had been secured, the house no longer needed to serve a marriage. It could serve Alva alone. The building had been constructed to prove that new money could purchase the appearance of old power. The divorce proved that the appearance was enough. The substance of the marriage could be discarded. The house would remain. The settlement did something else. It established that Marble House could be valued, transferred, and bargained with like any other asset. It was not sacred. It was not untouchable. It was property, and property could be weaponized. The fact that Alva could walk away from the marriage with the house as compensation meant that the building had always been separable from the family it was supposed to represent. The Vanderbilt name would remain attached to it, but the actual Vanderbilt who had paid for it no longer controlled it. The house had been built to signal dynastic permanence. The divorce revealed that permanence was never the goal. This was not how old money operated. The great estates of Europe and the landed families of England passed property through bloodlines, not through negotiation. A house like Chatsworth or Blenheim Palace could not be divided in a divorce settlement because it was not owned by individuals. It was held in trust, bound by entail, protected from the market. The family might lose power, but the estate remained intact. American wealth had no such structure. The Vanderbilts were not aristocrats. They were entrepreneurs. And Marble House, despite its French architecture and its imported marble, was an entrepreneurial asset. It could be bought, sold, or traded based on leverage and timing. Alva understood this better than most of her peers. She had grown up in Mobile, Alabama, in a family that had money before the Civil War and lost it afterward. She had married William in 1875, when the Vanderbilt fortune was still being consolidated by his father, William Henry Vanderbilt, who had inherited the empire from Cornelius Vanderbilt the Commodore. The Commodore had built the fortune through railroads and shipping, and he had built it ruthlessly. By the time Alva entered the family, the Vanderbilts were the richest family in America, but they were not respected. Respect required translation. Alva provided it. She turned railroad money into social capital by spending it in ways that mimicked European aristocracy. Marble House was the most aggressive example of that translation, but the divorce made clear that the translation was temporary. The house had served its purpose. It had opened doors. It had compelled invitations. It had allowed Alva to dictate terms to families who had previously dictated terms to her. Once that power had been secured, the marriage became optional. William had funded the house, but he had never controlled its meaning. Alva had, and now she would continue to control it without him. The building would remain a Vanderbilt property in name, but it would function as an extension of Alva's will, not the family's legacy. The children inherited nothing from the divorce itself. Consuelo, the eldest, was 18 in 1895. She would be married to the Duke of Marlborough later that year in a transaction that mirrored the logic of the divorce, titled European Aristocracy in Exchange for American Money. The marriage was arranged by Alva, negotiated like a corporate merger, and it made Consuelo a duchess. Marble House had been part of the preparation for that marriage. The house had trained Consuelo in the performance of aristocracy. It had shown her what money could purchase and what it could not. The divorce showed her something else, that the performance could outlast the marriage, that power was portable, and that buildings were more reliable than husbands. The settlement was finalized by summer. Alva kept Marble House and continued to summer in Newport. William kept the New York chateau and eventually remarried. The Vanderbilt empire continued, but it had fractured in a way that would become characteristic. The fortune was divisible. The buildings were separable. The family name could be attached to multiple competing centers of power. Marble House had been built to consolidate authority. The divorce distributed it. And in that distribution, the house stopped being a symbol of dynastic stability and became evidence of something else, that American fortunes could generate monuments, but they could not sustain the systems that made monuments meaningful. The house would survive, the marriage would not, and the distance bet. Those two facts would define everything that followed. Marble House was not built to be lived in. It was built to be recognized. The distinction mattered because recognition, in the world Alva Vanderbilt was trying to enter, could not be purchased directly. It had to be compelled. and compulsion required a different kind of architecture, not comfort, not utility, but argument. The house was designed to make a case that could not be ignored, that the Vanderbilts, despite their origins in steamships and railroads, despite the fact that their fortune was only 2 generations old, belonged at the center of American power. The case had to be made visually, materially, and expensively enough that refusal became impossible. In 1890, when construction on Marble House was underway, New York society was still controlled by families whose wealth predated the Republic. The Astors, the Livingstons, the Schermerhorns, these were families who had made fortunes in fur trading, real estate, and shipping in the 18th century. Their money was old enough to have been sanitized by time. They did not work. They did not build. They inherited, and they guarded that inheritance by controlling access to the institutions that conferred legitimacy: the opera boxes, the private balls, the lists of acceptable names. Mrs. Caroline Astor, who held more social authority than any elected official in New York, maintained a list of 400 families she considered worthy of recognition. The Vanderbilts were not on it. This was not an oversight. It was policy. The Astors and their peers did not object to the Vanderbilts because they were wealthy. They objected because the source of that wealth was too recent, too visible, and too violent. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had built his empire by undercutting competitors, bribing legislators, and consolidating control over New York's rail and shipping networks through methods that were legal but not genteel. His son, William Henry Vanderbilt, had doubled the fortune by managing it with similar ruthlessness. By the time Alva married into the family in 1875, the Vanderbilts were worth over $200 million, more than the Astors, more than any family in America, but they were still treated as outsiders. Alva understood that money alone would not change this. The Vanderbilts could outspend the Astors, but spending was not the same as belonging. Belonging required the appearance of inevitability, the sense that a family had always occupied its position, that its wealth was inherited rather than earned, that its power was cultural rather than financial. European aristocracy had this appearance because it was built into law. Titles were hereditary. Estates were entailed. The structure of the system made it seem permanent even when the families themselves were bankrupt or powerless. American society had no legal aristocracy, but it had constructed an informal one, and that aristocracy depended on the illusion of timelessness. The families who controlled New York society did not acknowledge new money because acknowledging it would reveal that their own power was contingent, that it could be duplicated, that it was not inevitable at all. Marble House was designed to shatter that illusion by adopting its logic. The house was modeled on the Petit Trianon, the neoclassical retreat built for Louis XV at Versailles in the 1760s. Richard Morris Hunt, the architect, had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and he understood how to replicate European forms with American capital. The exterior was faced entirely in white marble, shipped from quarries. That supplied the same stone used in classical monuments. The proportions were symmetrical, restrained, and monumental. The building looked as though it had been standing for centuries. It looked as though it had been inherited. It looked, in other words, like the kind of structure that old families occupied, even though it had been completed in 1892 and paid for with railroad dividends. The interiors reinforced the argument. The entry hall was lined with yellow marble from Siena. The ballroom was modeled on the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, with gilded bronze reliefs and a ceiling painted to resemble the sky. The library was paneled in walnut. The dining room featured rose marble columns, and the Gothic room, Alva's private sitting room, was filled with medieval artifacts purchased from European estates. Every material had been imported, every detail had been calculated to suggest that the Vanderbilts were not building wealth, they were inheriting culture. The house was a translation engine. It took industrial capital and converted it into the visual language of aristocracy. The cost was intentional. $500,000 was an absurd sum to spend on a summer house that would be occupied for 3 months each year. It was more than most families spent on a primary residence. It was more than the annual budget of several state governments. But the extravagance was not waste. It was proof. The house had to be expensive enough that it could not be dismissed. that it demonstrated command over resources so vast that they approached the scale of state power. European aristocracy derived legitimacy from titles and land. American aristocracy, if it was to exist at all, would have to derive it from visible expenditure. Marble House was designed to make that expenditure undeniable. The argument worked because it was structural, not rhetorical. Alva did not need to explain that the Vanderbilts deserved recognition. The House explained it. When Mrs. Astor was invited to the opening ball in August 1892, she attended. Her presence was not a gesture of goodwill. It was a concession. The House had created a situation in which refusing the invitation would have been more damaging than accepting it. To stay away would have been to acknowledge that the Vanderbilts had built something that rivaled the institutions Mrs. Astor controlled. To attend was to absorb them into the system, to neutralize the threat by granting recognition. Mrs. Astor attended. The Vanderbilts were added to the list, but the victory was conditional. Marble House had compelled acceptance, but it had not created the kind of power that sustains itself across generations. European aristocracy endured because it was protected by law. Estates could not be sold, titles could not be purchased, bloodlines were documented and enforced. American wealth had no such protections. It could be earned, and it could be lost. It could be divided among heirs, taxed by governments, or simply spent into irrelevance. Marble House demonstrated that industrial capital could mimic aristocracy, but it could not replicate the mechanisms that made aristocracy durable. The house was a monument to arrival, not to permanence. This was visible in the design itself. The Petit Trianon had been built for a king who ruled by divine right, whose power was theoretically absolute, and whose estate was protected by monarchy. Marble House was built for a woman whose power derived entirely from her ability to manage wealth that did not legally belong to her. Alva controlled the house because William funded it, and William funded it because the social capital it generated benefited the family's position. But that position was not guaranteed. It depended on continued wealth, continued spending, and continued recognition from a class that could withdraw its approval as easily as it had granted it. The house could be sold. The fortune could be divided. The family could fracture. None of this was prevented by law or tradition. It was only prevented by will. The families watching understood this. They accepted the Vanderbilts because refusing them had become impractical, but they did not mistake the acceptance for equivalence. The Astors had been wealthy for a century. The Vanderbilts had been wealthy for 50 years. The difference mattered because it revealed the instability beneath the performance. Marble House looked ancient, but everyone knew it was new. It looked inherited, but everyone knew it had been purchased. The illusion was effective, but it was still an illusion, and illusions required maintenance. They required continued investment, continued spectacle, continued proof that the fortune was not eroding. The house had won recognition, but it had not won security. Alva knew this. She had built Marble House to solve a problem: exclusion from the institutions that conferred legitimacy in American society. The house had solved that problem, but it had also revealed a deeper one. American industrial wealth could generate monuments, but it could not generate the systems that protected those monuments from dissolution. The fortune that built Marble House was enormous, but it was not structured to last. It was liquid, divisible, and vulnerable to the pressures that European estates had been legally insulated from for centuries. The house had been designed to look like the product of inherited power, but it was actually the product of accumulated capital, and capital did not obey the same rules as inheritance. The theorem, then, was partial. Marble House proved that American wealth could compete with European aristocracy in terms of visibility, scale, and cultural fluency. It LD not prove that American wealth could sustain itself the way European aristocracy had, through legal structures that protected estates from market forces and family disputes. The house had been built to make an argument. The argument had succeeded, but success had not changed the underlying conditions. The Vanderbilts were now inside the system, but they were not protected by it, and the house, despite its marble and its gold leaf, would eventually reveal what that distinction meant. Construction began in 1888 on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, on land that had been purchased specifically for its visibility. The site was not chosen for privacy or comfort. It was chosen because it could be seen from the water, from the roads, and from the other estates that lined Bellevue Avenue. Newport had been a summer resort for wealthy New Yorkers since the 1850s, but by the late 1880s, it was becoming something else, a proving ground. The families who summered there were building larger houses, throwing more elaborate parties, and using the condensed 3-month season to display wealth in ways that would have been considered excessive in the city. Alva Vanderbilt understood that Newport was a laboratory for social power. Marble House would be the most controlled experiment yet conducted there. Richard Morris Hunt was hired because he had already demonstrated that he could translate Alva's vision into structure. He had designed the Vanderbilt Chateau at 665th Avenue, completed in 1882, which had established the family's presence in Manhattan. But that house had been cautious. It was large, but it was surrounded by other large houses. It was expensive, but not illegible. Alva wanted something more explicit for Newport. She wanted a building that did not apologize for its cost, that did not hedge its references, that made its argument in a single, undeniable form. Hunt had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, the first American to complete the program, and he understood how to work within the formal language of French neoclassicism. He knew how to make a house look like it had been built by a state rather than a family. The model was the Petit Trianon at Versailles, completed in 1768 for Louis XV. Alva did not want an interpretation. She wanted replication. The proportions, the symmetry, the restraint, these were not stylistic preferences. They were structural requirements. The Petit Trianon had been built to demonstrate royal authority through architectural clarity. Marble House would demonstrate financial authority through the same means. Hunt produced drawings that adhered to the original dimensions, but scaled for an American estate rather than a royal retreat. The building would be 50 feet tall, with a footprint of roughly 11,000 square feet. It would be faced entirely in marble. It would have no visible concessions to comfort or informality. Every surface would be finished, every detail calculated, every material imported from sources that carried historical weight. The marble came from quarries in Europe and New England. The exterior was white marble, chosen for its visual purity and its association with classical monuments. The interior stone was more varied: yellow sienna marble for the entry hall, rose Numidian marble for the dining room, green marble from the Alps for accents. Each type of stone had to be sourced, cut, shipped, and installed by craftsmen who understood how to work with material that could not be replaced if damaged. The cost of the stone alone exceeded the construction budgets of most houses being built in Newport at the time. But cost was not the concern. Legibility was. The house had to communicate instantly and without explanation that the Vanderbilts commanded resources on a scale that could not be dismissed. Hunt's office managed the logistics. Contracts were issued to suppliers in Italy, France, and Belgium. Stonecutters, bronze workers, and gilders were hired from workshops that served European palaces and churches. The labor was organized in tiers. American contractors handled the foundation and structural framing. European craftsmen handled the finishes. The division was intentional. The structure could be American, but the surfaces had to be European. The house was not being built to reflect American identity. It was being built to mimic the institutions that conferred legitimacy in the only culture that American elites considered superior to their own. The work proceeded without interruption. There were no delays, no cost overruns, no negotiations over materials. Alva visited the site regularly, accompanied by Hunt, and made adjustments to interior details as the building took shape. The ballroom ceiling was repainted twice before she approved the final version. The Gothic room, which would serve as her private sitting room, required custom woodwork and the installation of medieval artifacts she had purchased from estates in England and France. These were not decorative choices. They were evidentiary. The artifacts proved that the Vanderbilts had access to the same objects that filled the collections of European aristocracy. They proved that history, or at least pieces of it, could be purchased and reassembled in ways that served new purposes. By 1892, the house was finished. The total cost exceeded $500,000, though the final accounting was never made public. The expense was not hidden, but it was not itemized. The house was meant to be read as a totality, not as a sum of parts. What mattered was not how much each element cost, but that the combined effect was overwhelming. The entry hall opened onto a space lined with yellow marble and bronze. The grand staircase was framed by columns that rose 2 stories. The ballroom stretched 50 feet, with gilded walls and a ceiling painted to resemble open sky. The dining room featured pink marble columns and a table that could seat 30. Every room was designed to eliminate intimacy. There was no space in Marble House where a visitor could forget they were being observed, judged, and measured against a standard that had been constructed for exactly that purpose. The house opened in August with a ball. The invitations were issued 6 weeks in advance, printed on heavy cardstock with no decoration beyond the Vanderbilt name. The guest list was deliberate. Mrs. Astor was invited. The Astors had ignored previous Vanderbilt events, but this invitation could not be ignored. Refusing would have required a public justification, and there was no justification that would not sound defensive. Mrs. Astor attended. Her attendance was documented in the society pages of every New York newspaper. The ball itself was less important than the fact that it had occurred, that Mrs. Astor had entered Marble House, and that her presence had legitimized the building and the family that built it. The event was orchestrated to maximize that legitimacy. Guests arrived by carriage and were received in the entry hall, where the marble and bronze eliminated any possibility of casual conversation. They moved through the ground floor rooms, each of which had been staged to demonstrate a different aspect of European cultural fluency. The Gothic room displayed medieval artifacts. The library displayed rare volumes bound in leather. The dining room displayed porcelain and silver that had been commissioned from European workshops. The ballroom was where the performance culminated. Alva stood at the center, receiving guests, directing conversation, controlling the flow of attention. She wore a costume designed to resemble a Venetian princess, and the costume was not ironic. It was a statement. She was not pretending to be European aristocracy. She was demonstrating that she could perform the role as convincingly as anyone born to it. The ball worked because the house worked. Mrs. Astor's attendance was not a personal gesture. It was a structural concession. Marble House had created a situation in which the old families could no longer maintain our monopoly on legitimacy by simply refusing to recognize new wealth. The Vanderbilts had spent enough, built precisely enough, and replicated European forms accurately enough that exclusion would have required the old families to admit that their own power was based on convention rather than inevitability. Mrs. Astor attended because not attending would have revealed that the system she controlled was vulnerable. The house had forced her hand. Hunt understood this. He had designed the building not as a residence but as a mechanism. The marble was not chosen for beauty. It was chosen because it could not be purchased casually, because it required resources and coordination that only families with access to industrial capital could command. The interiors were not designed for comfort. They were designed to eliminate any possibility that a visitor could feel at ease, could forget that they were in a space constructed to demonstrate dominance. The house did not invite, it compelled. And compulsion, in the context of American society in the 1890s, was the only force powerful enough to overcome the inertia of inherited privilege. The construction had taken 4 years. The ball lasted 1 night. But the effect was permanent. Marble House became the standard against which other Newport estates were measured. Families who had been building modest summer cottages began commissioning architects to design palaces. The scale of expenditure increased. The formality of the season intensified. Newport stopped being a resort and became a theater, and Marble House was the stage that defined what kind of performance was required to hold power. The house had not just succeeded in securing the Vanderbilts' position. It had changed the rules for everyone else. But the success was tactical, not structural. The house had compelled recognition, but recognition was not the same as security. Beeley House could force Mrs. Astor to attend a ball, but it could not protect the Vanderbilt fortune from division, taxation, or the generational diffusion that would eventually erode it. The house was a machine, and it had functioned exactly as designed. But machines require maintenance. They require fuel, and the fuel, Vanderbilt capital. was finite. The house had been built to solve a problem in 1892. It would take decades to discover that the problem it solved was temporary, and that the structure it created could not outlast the conditions that made it necessary. Marble House required a staff of 36 to operate at full capacity. This was not a permanent household. It was a seasonal deployment. The servants arrived in late May, several weeks before the Vanderbilts, and they left in early September, after the family had returned to New York. Their work was not to maintain a home. It was to activate a mechanism that had been dormant for 9 months. The house did not function year-round because it was not designed to. It was designed to operate during the Newport season, when the concentration of wealth and attention made performance worthwhile. Outside that window, the house was closed, its rooms shuttered, its systems suspended. The staff was divided into tiers that mirrored the division between visibility and function. At the top were the butler, the housekeeper, and Alva's personal maid. These were salaried positions, held by individuals who had worked for the Vanderbilts for years, and who understood that their authority derived not from rank alone, but from proximity to Alva. The butler managed the male staff and oversaw the public-facing rooms, the entry hall, the dining room, the ballroom. The housekeeper managed the female staff and oversaw the private quarters, the bedrooms, the service corridors, the linen closets. Alva's maid answered to no one but Alva. She dressed her, managed her correspondence, and controlled access to her time. The three formed a command structure that ensured the house operated without requiring Alva to issue direct orders. The system was designed so that her presence alone was sufficient to maintain discipline. Beneath them were the footmen, maids, cooks, and laundresses, workers hired seasonally, often from agencies in New York or Boston, sometimes from families, who had worked for other Newport estates. These positions were not permanent. They lasted 3 months, and they paid well enough to make the instability tolerable. A footman at Marble House could earn more in a summer than he would in 6 months of year-round employment elsewhere. But the work was exhausting. The house had to be cleaned daily, though it generated almost no actual dirt. Floors had to be polished, though no one walked on them. Silver had to be polished, though most of it was never used. The labor was not functional. It was presentational. The house had to look as though it required constant maintenance, as though its perfection was the result of invisible, endless work. The division between family space and performance space was absolute. The Vanderbilts occupied the second floor, bedrooms, dressing rooms, private sitting areas. These rooms were comfortable, but they were not the focus of the house. They were where the family prepared for the performance that occurred downstairs. Alva's bedroom faced the ocean. It was smaller than the Gothic room, less ornate than the ballroom, and it was the only space in the house where she could be alone without being observed by staff. But even there, the architecture reminded her that privacy was conditional. The walls were paneled, the furniture was French, and the windows overlooked a landscape that had been purchased and sculpted to serve the same purpose as the house itself, to demonstrate control. The ground floor was where the house fulfilled its function. The entry hall, the ballroom, the dining room, the library. These were not rooms in the domestic sense. They were stages. They were designed to be walked through, admired, and remembered. They were designed to eliminate any possibility of informal interaction. The ballroom could hold 200 guests, but it was uncomfortable for 2. The dining room could seat 30, but it was too formal for family meals. The library contained books, but it was not designed for reading. It was designed to suggest that the Vanderbilts were the kind of people who read, who valued intellectual refinement, who had inherited not just wealth but culture. The books themselves were props. Many of them had been purchased in bulk from European dealers and had never been opened. The daily routine during the season followed a script. Breakfast was served in the morning room, a smaller space adjacent to the dining room. The family ate privately. Lunch was informal, often taken on the terrace if the weather permitted. Afternoons were reserved for social calls, carriage rides, or tennis at the casino. Dinner was the main event. It began at 8 and could last 3 hours. Guests were received in the entry hall, moved through the ground floor rooms for cocktails, and then seated in the dining room for a meal that was prepared by a French chef hired specifically for the season. The menu was printed in French. The service was formal. The conversation was monitored. Alva sat at the head of the table and controlled the flow of discussion. redirecting topics that bored her, silencing guests who spoke too long, orchestrating the evening as though it were a performance she had written and was now directing. The kitchen was located in the basement, separated from the dining room by a service staircase that allowed food to be transported without servants being seen. The chef worked with a staff of 4, 2 sous chefs, a pastry chef, and a scullery maid, who cleaned the equipment after each meal. The kitchen was equipped with coal-fired ranges, ice boxes, and copper cookware imported from France. It was a professional operation, designed to produce meals that could compete with the best restaurants in New York or Paris, but it operated only during the season. The rest of the year, the kitchen was empty. The ranges were cold. The company, PR pots were wrapped and stored. The space was not maintained for future use. It was maintained to prevent decay. The same logic applied to the rest of the house. The marble floors were waxed weekly, not because they needed it, but because neglect would have been visible. The bronze fixtures were polished. The draperies were aired. The furniture was dusted. The ballroom, which was used perhaps a dozen times each summer, required constant attention. The gilded surfaces collected moisture from the ocean air. The painted ceiling had to be inspected for cracks. The chandeliers had to be cleaned crystal by crystal. The cost of maintaining the room exceeded the cost of operating most middle-class households for a year, but the cost was not questioned. The room existed to be perfect, and perfection required resources that could not be reduced or deferred. The staff lived on the 3rd floor, in rooms that were functional but not comfortable. The accommodations were better than what most servants experienced in other estates. Private rooms rather than shared dormitories, adequate ventilation, access to indoor plumbing, but they were still servant quarters. The ceilings were lower. The finishes were plain. The windows were smaller. The separation between the family's world and the staff's world was architectural. It was designed into the structure. The servants used separate staircases, separate entrances, and separate corridors. They were not supposed to be seen unless they were performing a task. When they moved through the house, they moved invisibly, maintaining the illusion that the space operated without labor, that the perfection was natural rather than constructed. This invisibility was essential to the house's function. Marble House was designed to present wealth as effortless, as something that did not require management or maintenance, as something that simply exists. D. The presence of servants would have undermined that presentation. It would have revealed that the house was a system, that it required coordination and expense, that the appearance of inevitability was the result of deliberate effort. The staff understood this. They were trained not to make eye contact with guests, not to speak unless spoken to, not to occupy space in ways that would draw attention. Their work was to maintain the performance without becoming part of it. The house was occupied for roughly 12 weeks each year. The rest of the time, it sat empty. A caretaker remained on site during the off-season, along with a groundskeeper who maintained the lawns and gardens. The interior was closed. Furniture was covered with sheets. Windows were shuttered. The house entered a state of suspension. It was not abandoned, but it was not alive. It waited. And waiting required almost as much expense as operation. The structure had to be heated minimally to prevent moisture damage. The roof had to be inspected. The plumbing had to be winterized. The costs accumulated even when the house was not being used. This was the reality beneath the performance. Marble House was not a residence. It was an instrument that required continuous investment to remain functional. The Vanderbilts did not live there. They activated it. And activation required not just money, but a willingness to spend money on systems that produced no return beyond visibility. The house generated no income. It provided no utility beyond the social capital it conferred during the summer season, and even that capital was conditional. It depended on the Vanderbilts continuing to occupy the house, continuing to throw parties, continuing to maintain the standard they had established. If they stopped, the house would not collapse. It would simply become irrelevant. The waste was not incidental. It was structure. The house had been designed to demonstrate that the Vanderbilts could afford to waste resources on a scale that other families could not match. The 36 servants, the imported chef, the constant maintenance, the 9 months of closure, these were not inefficiencies. They were proof. They proved that the Vanderbilts did not need to economize, that they could sustain expenditures that served no practical purpose, that their wealth was so vast it could be deployed purely for display. The house was a machine designed to burn capital in ways that were visible, measurable, and impossible to replicate without equivalent resources. And for a time, that machine worked exactly as intended. Between 1892 and 1902, Marble House operated at the center of Newport's social architecture. Alva controlled the guest lists for the most important events of the season. She decided who received invitations to the annual ball, who was seated next to whom at dinner, who was granted access to the private afternoons on the terrace. Her authority was not granted by institution or title. It was maintained through the house itself, and through her willingness to use exclusion as a tool. Families who wanted recognition had to pass through Marble House, and passage required submission to Alva's terms. The mechanism was simple. Newport's summer season compressed the social calendar of an entire year into 12 weeks. Every family of consequence summered there, and every family competed for the same limited resource, visibility at the right events, in the right company, under the right conditions. Alva understood that scarcity created value. She did not host more events than other families. She hosted fewer. But the events she hosted carried more weight because attendance signaled that Alva had chosen to recognize you. Refusal to attend or failure to receive an invitation signaled the opposite. The system worked because everyone participating understood that the stakes were not social comfort but social survival. This was most visible in the orchestration of marriages. Alva had married her daughter Consuelo to the Duke of Marlborough in 1895, 3 years after Marble House opened. The marriage had been arranged with the precision of a corporate merger. The Duke needed money to maintain Blenheim Palace. Consuelo brought a dowry of $2.5 million in railroad stock, along with an annual income of $100,000. In exchange, Consuelo became a duchess, and the Vanderbilts secured a direct connection to British aristocracy. The marriage was negotiated at Marble House, finalized at Marble House, and announced from Marble House. The building was not a backdrop. It was the instrument that made the transaction legible. The marriage established a template. Other American heiresses followed. Families with industrial fortunes began seeking titled Europeans who needed capital. The arrangements were pragmatic. The Americans gained access to aristocratic lineage. The Europeans gained access to liquid wealth. Marble House became the staging ground for these negotiations. Alva hosted visiting European aristocrats during the summer season, introduced them to families with marriageable daughters, and facilitated the conversations that led to contracts. She did not do this out of generosity. She did it because each successful marriage reinforced her position as the broker between American capital and European legitimacy. The house had compelled her own recognition. Now it was compelling recognition for others, and the brokerage fee was loyalty, but the system depended entirely on Alva's personal authority. There was no institution behind it, no legal structure, no mechanism that would survive her absence. She controlled access to Marble House because she owned it. She controlled the social calendar because other families deferred to her, but deference was conditional. It lasted only as long as the Vanderbilt fortune remained concentrated, as long as Alva remained willing to enforce the system, and as long as Newport remained the uncontested center of American elite society. All three conditions were already showing signs of strain. The fortune was still enormous. William Kissam Vanderbilt, despite the divorce, remained one of the wealthiest men in America. But the concentration that had defined the first 2 generations of Vanderbilt wealth was beginning to diffuse. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had left nearly his entire fortune to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt. William Henry had divided it more evenly among his children, but the bulk still went to his 2 eldest sons, Cornelius II and William Kissam. By the 3rd generation, the fortune was being divided among more heirs, and those heirs were spending at rates that outpaced the growth of the underlying assets. The railroad empire that had generated the wealth was stabilizing. It was no longer expanding at the explosive rates of the 1870s and 1880s. The fortune was still growing, but more slowly. And the expenditures, estates, yachts, art collections, European marriages, were accelerating. Alva's authority was also personal in a way that made it vulnerable. She had built her position through force of will and strategic spending, but she had not built institutions that could outlast her. Marble House was hers, but it was not a foundation or a trust. It was private property that could be sold, inherited, or abandoned. The social network she controlled existed only as long as she chose to maintain it. There was no succession plan. Her children were not positioned to inherit her role. Consuelo had been married off to England and would spend most of her adult life trying to escape the arrangement. Her sons, William and Harold, were heirs to the Vanderbilt fortune, but they had no interest in managing Newport society. The system Alva had constructed would not survive her withdrawal from it. Newport itself was also changing. By the late 1890s, the scale of expenditure required to maintain visibility had escalated beyond what even the wealthiest families considered reasonable. The Breakers, completed in 1895 by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, was larger than Marble House and cost more to build. Other families followed: Rosecliff, Belcourt, Ochre Court. Each estate tried to exceed the last in scale, ornamentation, and expense. The competition had become unsustainable. Families were spending millions of dollars on houses they occupied for 3 months each year, and the return on that investment was diminishing. The social capital generated by a new estate was lasting for shorter periods. The novelty wore off faster. The audience was becoming desensitized. There were also external pressures. The press was beginning to cover Newport with a tone that was less admiring and more critical. Journalists documented the excesses, the cost of the balls, the waste of the banquets, the servants required to maintain the estates, and framed them as evidence of decadence rather than achievement. The coverage was not neutral, it was moralizing, and it was reaching audiences who did not participate in Newport society but who were beginning to resent the concentration of wealth it represented. The families who summered in Newport were still powerful, but they were no longer insulated from scrutiny. Public opinion was starting to matter in ways it had not mattered a decade earlier. Alva understood the fragility, even if she did not acknowledge it publicly. By 1895, she had already divorced William and secured Marble House as her own asset. The divorce had been strategic, but it had also been a hedge. It separated her authority from the Vanderbilt family structure and gave her control over the building, independent of the fortune that had built it. She remarried in 1896 to Oliver Belmont, another industrialist with a Newport estate, and she began dividing her time between Marble House and Belcourt Castle, Belmont's property. The shift was subtle, but it was significant. She was no longer fully invested in Marble House as the center of her power. She was diversifying. The peak, then, was not a plateau. It was a moment of maximum tension. Marble House was functioning exactly as designed. Alva was exercising more social authority than any woman in America. The Vanderbilt fortune was still intact, but the conditions that made all of this possible were eroding. The fortune was diffusing. Alva's authority was unsupported by institutions. Newport was becoming a spectacle rather than a proving ground. And the broader culture was beginning to question whether the concentration of wealth represented by places like Marble House was sustainable or desirable. The house continued to operate. The summer seasons continued. The balls were still held, the dinners were still elaborate, the guest lists were still controlled. But the system was running on momentum. It was not generating new energy. Alva could enforce loyalty, but she could not create successors. She could dictate terms, but she could not prevent other families from building larger houses or throwing more extravagant parties. She could maintain her position, but she could not make that position inheritable. The house had been built to compel recognition, and it had succeeded. But recognition was not the same as permanence, and by the turn of the century, the distinction was becoming visible to anyone willing to look closely. The apex lasted roughly a decade. It was not a collapse, it was a realization. Marble House had proven that American industrial wealth could compete with European aristocracy in terms of visibility and cultural fluency. But it had also revealed that competition was not the same as equivalence. European aristocracy had legal structures, entail, primogeniture, hereditary titles, that protected estates and families from the market forces that were already beginning to erode the Vanderbilt fortune. American wealth had no such protections. It could build monuments, but it could not sustain the systems that made monuments meaningful across generations. Marble House had reached its maximum influence. What remained was the question of how long that influence could be maintained, and at what cost. Alva married Oliver Belmont in January 1896, less than a year after the divorce from William Kissam Vanderbilt was finalized. The marriage was strategic, but it was also a relocation. Belmont owned Belcourt Castle, a 60-room estate on Bellevue Avenue designed by Richard Morris Hunt and completed in 1894. It was newer than Marble House, slightly larger, and organized around Belmont's obsession with horses and medieval armor. The estate included stables on the ground floor, connected directly to the main residence, and the interiors were filled with European antiquities that Belmont had spent decades collecting. Alva moved into Belcourt and brought her energy with her. Marble House remained her property, but it was no longer her residence. The house had been built to serve her ambitions. Now those ambitions had moved elsewhere. The transition was gradual but unmistakable. During the summer seasons of the late 1890s, Alva still hosted events at Marble House, but they were less frequent and less central to Newport's social calendar. Belcourt became the primary venue for her entertaining. The shift was partly practical. Belmont's estate was better suited to his interests, and Alva adapted her routines to accommodate them. But it was also symbolic. Marble House had been constructed to compel recognition from families who had treated the Vanderbilts as outsiders. By 1896, that recognition had been secured. The house had fulfilled its purpose. Continuing to operate it as the center of her social apparatus would have been redundant. Alva was not sentimental about architecture. The house had been a tool. The tool had worked. She moved on. Marble House did not sit empty. Alva kept a skeleton staff on site during the summer months, and she occasionally opened the house for afternoon teas or smaller gatherings. But the ballroom, which had been the center of Newport society in the early 1890s, was used less and less. The dining room hosted fewer dinners. The guest lists shrank. The house was maintained, but it was not activated in the way it had been during its first decade. The maintenance itself became a kind of performance, proof that Alva could afford to preserve a property she no longer needed, that the Vanderbilt fortune was still large enough to sustain redundancy. But the performance was passive. The house was no longer making arguments. It was simply existing. The shift accelerated after Oliver Belmont died in 1908. Alva inherited Belcourt and consolidated her resources there, but she also began redirecting her attention toward political causes. She had always been interested in power, but her focus had been social rather than ideological. By the early 1900s, that focus was changing. The women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum, and Alva saw in it an opportunity to exercise authority in a new arena. She joined the National American Woman Suffrage Association and began using her wealth to fund organizing efforts, publicity campaigns, and lobbying initiatives. The cause gave her a platform that did not depend on Newport, that did not require her to maintain a seasonal household, and that allowed her to position herself as a reformer rather than a representative of the gilded elite she had spent decades trying to join. In 1909, she opened Marble House to the suffrage movement. The decision was deliberate and symbolic. She hosted a conference of suffrage leaders in the ballroom, the same room where she had once choreographed the social calendar that dictated who belonged in American society. The contrast was intentional. The house that had been built to demonstrate the power of concentrated wealth was now being used to advocate for political reforms that would, in theory, redistribute power more broadly. The press covered the event extensively, often noting the irony. Alva did not deny it. She framed her involvement in suffrage as an extension of the same instinct that had driven her to build Marble House, the belief that women could exercise authority if they controlled the right instruments. The house had been one instrument. Political organizing was another. The suffrage meetings continued sporadically over the next decade. Alva funded the construction of a small Chinese tea house on the grounds of Marble House, designed as a meeting space for suffrage organizers. She hosted fundraisers, strategy sessions, and public lectures. The house became associated with the movement. though it was never the movement's headquarters. The meetings were symbolic rather than operational. They demonstrated that Alva was willing to repurpose the house, that she was not bound by the original purpose it had been designed to serve. But they also revealed that the house no longer had a coherent function. It was being used, but it was not being used consistently. It had become a space that could be activated for different purposes depending on Alva's interests at any given moment. By 1920, Marble House had been standing for nearly 30 years, but it had only functioned as intended for roughly a decade. The rest of the time, it had been maintained without purpose. The staff was reduced to a caretaker and a groundskeeper. The rooms were opened occasionally for suffrage events or private gatherings, but the house was no longer a center of anything. It was a monument to a system that had already moved on. Newport itself was changing. The scale of expenditure that had defined the 1890s was no longer sustainable, and many of the families who had built estates there were spending less time in them. The summer season was shorter. The events were less elaborate. The competition for visibility had lost its intensity. Alva spent less time in Newport as she aged. She maintained ownership of Marble House, but she rarely stayed there for more than a few weeks each summer. Her primary residences were in New York and Paris. The house became one property among several, notable for its history but not for its function. She did not sell it, but she also did not invest in it. The maintenance continued, but only at the level necessary to prevent decay. The house was preserved, but preservation was not the same as use. It was being kept intact not because it served a purpose, but because disposing of it would have required, acknowledging that it had outlived its relevance. The suffrage meetings, which had given the house a temporary sense of purpose, ended after the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. The movement had succeeded, and Alva's involvement in it diminished. She continued to fund political causes, but she no longer needed Marble House as a venue. The Chinese tea house remained on the grounds, a relic of the suffrage era, but it was rarely used. The house returned to a state of suspension. It was maintained, but it was not occupied. It was owned, but it was not lived in. The distinction mattered because it revealed what the house had always been, not a home, but an instrument that had been designed for a specific function and had ceased to be necessary once that function had been fulfilled. The irony was structural. Marble House had been built to prove that American industrial wealth could replicate the appearance of European aristocracy. It had succeeded in that proof. But the success had been temporary because the conditions that made the house necessary, exclusion from established society, the need to compel recognition, the concentration of Vanderbilt wealth, had all changed. Alva no longer needed to compel recognition. She had it. The Vanderbilt fortune was still enormous, but it was being divided among more heirs and was no longer concentrated in ways that made projects like Marble House feasible. And the society that had once gate-kept access so rigorously was itself fragmenting, becoming less cohesive, less authoritative, less able to confer the kind of legitimacy that had mattered in the 1890s. The house had been designed to look ancient, to suggest inheritance and permanence. But by 1920, it was clear that it was neither ancient nor permanent. It was a 30-year-old building that had served its purpose and was now being maintained out of inertia rather than necessity. The marble was still white, the bronze was still polished, the rooms were still intact, but the context that had made them meaningful was gone. The house had not been destroyed. It had been bypassed. The system it had been built to navigate no longer operated in the same way, and the house had no function within the system that replaced it. Alva did not abandon Marble House. She kept it, maintained it, and allowed it to remain associated with her name. But she treated it the way one treats evidence of a successful campaign that is now over. The house had proven what she needed it to prove. It had compelled Mrs. Astor to attend a ball. It had positioned the Vanderbilts at the center of Newport society. It had facilitated the marriage of her daughter to a duke. It had demonstrated that new money could purchase the appearance of old power. All of these things had been accomplished. The house had worked. But working did not mean lasting. By the time Alva died in 1933, Marble House had been functionally obsolete for over a decade. It was still standing. It was still hers. But it was no longer part of any active system. It was not a residence, not a venue, not a center of power. It was a memorial to a brief period in which a specific kind of social authority could be purchased through architecture and expenditure. The house had been built to solve a problem that no longer existed. And without that problem, the house was simply a structure, expensive, intact, and increasingly irrelevant. The transfer from instrument to relic had not happened suddenly. It had happened gradually, as the conditions that made the house necessary eroded and were not replaced. The house remained. The system that gave it meaning did not. The Vanderbilt fortune, at its height in 1877, was valued at over $200 million. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had built it through railroads and shipping, consolidating control over New York's transportation networks through methods that were effective but not gentle. When he died, he left nearly his entire estate to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt, with minimal provisions for his other children. The decision was deliberate. The Commodore understood that wealth, to remain powerful, had to remain concentrated. Division meant dilution. William Henry inherited the empire intact. William Henry doubled it. By the time he died in 1885, the fortune was worth over $400 million, making him the wealthiest man in America. But William Henry did not follow his father's model. He divided the fortune more evenly among his children, leaving the largest shares to his two eldest sons, Cornelius II and William Kissam, but also providing substantial inheritances to his other 6 children. The division was not reckless. Each heir received tens of millions of dollars, but the concentration that had defined the first 2 generations was already beginning to fracture. The fortune was still enormous, but it was no longer controlled by a single authority. It was distributed among 8 individuals, each of whom had different priorities, different spending habits, and different ideas about what wealth was for. By the 1890s, the 3rd generation was inheriting. Cornelius II had 11 children. William Kissam had 3. The other heirs had their own families. The fortune was being divided again, and this time the division was accompanied by expenditures that exceeded the growth of the underlying assets. The railroads that had generated the wealth were still profitable, but they were no longer expanding at the rates of the 1870s and 1880s. The infrastructure was complete. The routes were established. The industry was maturing. The fortune was growing, but more slowly, and the spending was accelerating. The estates were the most visible symptom. Marble House had cost over $500,000. The breakers, completed by Cornelius II in 1895, cost $7 million. Biltmore, the North Carolina estate built by George Washington Vanderbilt II, cost over $6 million and required hundreds of staff to operate. These were not investments. They were expenditures. They generated no income. They required constant maintenance. And they were being built at a time when the fortune was no longer concentrated enough to absorb costs of that scale without consequence. Each estate reduced the liquid capital available to the next generation. Each one locked wealth into structures that could not be easily sold or monetized. The tax environment was also changing. In 1916, the federal government introduced the estate tax, initially at a rate of 10% on estates over $5 million. The rate increased over the following decades, reaching 70% by the mid-20th century. The Vanderbilt fortune, which had been accumulated in an era with no federal income tax and no estate tax, was now subject to policies designed explicitly to prevent the kind of dynastic concentration the Commodore had created. Each generational transfer triggered a tax event. Each tax event reduced the total wealth available to the heirs. The fortune was being eroded not just by spending but by policy. The 3rd generation did not manage the fortune the way the first 2 had. Cornelius and William Henry had been operators. They had run railroads, negotiated with competitors, lobbied legislators, and defended their control over infrastructure through litigation and strategic acquisitions. Their children were not operators. They were inheritors. They had grown up wealthy, educated in private schools and European universities, trained to occupy social positions rather than manage enterprises. Some of them served on corporate boards or held ceremonial roles in the family's business interests, but none of them exercised the kind of direct control that the Commodore or William Henry had. The fortune was increasingly managed by trustees, lawyers, and financial advisors. The family retained ownership, but they no longer controlled operations. The fourth generation inherited even less. By the 1920s and 1930s, the Vanderbilt fortune had been divided among dozens of heirs, each of whom received a fraction of what their grandparents had controlled. The estates that had been built in the 1890s were becoming liabilities. The breakers required a staff of 40 and cost tens of thousands of dollars annually to maintain. Biltmore was even more expensive. Most of the heirs could not afford to operate these properties at full capacity. They reduced staff, closed wings, and spent less time in residence. Some estates were sold, others were leased. A few were simply abandoned. The liquidation was not sudden. It was incremental. The New York chateau that William Henry had built on Fifth Avenue was demolished in the 1920s to make way for commercial development. Other Manhattan properties followed. The Vanderbilt Row on Fifth Avenue, which had once symbolized the family's dominance, was dismantled piece by piece as heirs sold land to developers who could generate higher returns than residential real estate. The sales were pragmatic. The heirs needed liquidity, and the properties were worth more as development sites than as family residences. But each sale reduced the family's visible presence in New York. The concentration of Vanderbilt power, which had been architectural as well as financial, was dissolving. NUPO. RT estates fared slightly better, but only because some were donated rather than demolished. The Breakers was given to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1948 by Countess Gladys Shekenyi, the daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II. The donation allowed her to avoid the maintenance costs while retaining limited use of the upper floors. Other families followed similar strategies. The estates were too expensive to maintain, too large to sell as private residences, and too historically significant to demolish without public backlash. Donation became a form of disposal that preserved the structures while transferring the financial burden to nonprofit organizations or municipal governments. Marble House survived longer than most because Alva held on to it. When she died in 1933, the house passed to her son Harold, who had no interest in maintaining it as a residence. He kept the property but did not occupy it. The house sat largely unused for 2 decades. Harold died in 1956, and his heirs faced the same calculation that had confronted other Vanderbilt descendants. The house was worth more as a donation than as a private asset. In 1963, Harold's widow gave Marble House to the Preservation Society. The donation eliminated the maintenance costs and provided a tax deduction. The house was preserved, but it ceased to be a Vanderbilt property. The transfer marked the end of the family's direct control over the structure that had once been the most aggressive statement of their social authority. The broader fortune followed a similar trajectory. By the mid-20th century, most of the Vanderbilt wealth had been dispersed. Some heirs retained significant assets, but none commanded the kind of concentrated capital that the Commodore or William Henry had controlled. The railroads had been nationalized, sold, or absorbed into larger corporate entities. The real estate had been liquidated. The art collections had been donated or auctioned. The fortune had not disappeared. It had simply been divided so many times across so many heirs that it no longer functioned as dynastic capital. The fourth and fifth generations inherited money, but they did not inherit power. They did not inherit institutions. They inherited fragments. The structural failure was fundamental. American industrial wealth had been generated through entrepreneurial activity in an unregulated environment with no income tax, no estate tax, and minimal corporate oversight. The fortunes built during that period were enormous, but they were not protected by the legal mechanisms that had sustained European aristocracy for centuries. There was no primogeniture to prevent division among heirs. There was no entail to protect estates from being sold or mortgaged. There were no hereditary titles to preserve family identity across generations. The wealth could be earned, and it could be lost. And without legal protections, it was inevitably eroded by taxes, spending, and generational diffusion. The Vanderbilts had built monuments, Marble House, the Breakers, Biltmore, but monuments required continuous capital to remain meaningful. The fortune that built them was finite. The tax policies introduced in the early 20th century were designed to prevent exactly the kind of dynastic concentration the Vanderbilts represented. The policies worked. The fortune was taxed, divided, and dispersed. The estates were donated, sold, or demolished. The family name remained recognizable, but it no longer signified power. It signified history. Marble House had been built to demonstrate that American industrial wealth could compete with European aristocracy. The demonstration had succeeded. But the competition had been aesthetic, not structural. The house looked like a palace. It functioned like a palace. But it was not protected like a palace. It could be sold, divided, or abandoned based on the financial pressures facing its owners. And those pressures, over time, proved more powerful than the marble and gold leaf that had been assembled to resist them. The Vanderbilt fortune had hollowed out not because it had been squandered, but because it had been designed for a system that no longer existed and had never developed the mechanisms necessary to sustain itself across the kind of generational transitions that European wealth had navigated for centuries. The donation was finalized in 1963. Harold Vanderbilt had died 7 years earlier, and his widow, Gertrude, inherited Marble House, along with the obligation to maintain it. She had no interest in occupying the property. The house had been closed for most of the previous decade, opened only occasionally for private events or brief summer stays. The cost of maintaining it, insurance, property taxes, a skeleton staff to prevent deterioration, exceeded any practical use she could extract from it. The Preservation Society of Newport County had been acquiring estates since the 1940s, converting them into museums to generate tourism revenue for a city whose economy had declined after the Navy reduced its presence following World War II. Gertrude offered Marble House to the Society with conditions that allowed her limited access to the upper floors. The Society accepted. The house became public property. The transfer was not unusual. By the early 1960s, most of the Newport estates built during the Gilded Age had been donated, sold, or converted. The breakers had been transferred to the Preservation Society in 1948. Rosecliff followed in 1971. The pattern was consistent. Families could no longer afford to maintain properties that had been designed for an economic system that no longer existed. The estates required full-time staff, constant repairs, and property taxes calculated on valuations that bore no relationship to their utility as residences. Donations solved these problems. It eliminated the financial burden, provided a tax deduction, and allowed the families to retain some symbolic connection to the properties without the cost of ownership. The Preservation Society was not a heritage organization in the European sense. It was not preserving estates because they represented aristocratic continuity or cultural inheritance. It was preserving them because they could be monetized. Newport's economy in the 1960s depended on tourism. The naval base, which had employed thousands of workers during the war, had scaled back operations. The summer season, which had once brought wealthy families to the city for 3 months each year, was shorter and less lucrative. The estates, if open to the public, could generate ticket revenue, attract visitors, and support local businesses. The preservation was economic, not sentimental. Marble House opened as a museum in 1963. The admission fee was $1. Visitors entered through the same doors that had once admitted only those on Alva's guest list. They walked through the entry hall, the ballroom, the dining room, the Gothic room. The interiors had been preserved largely intact. The furniture, the fixtures, the gilded surfaces all remained as they had been during the house's operational years. But the context was gone. The house was no longer a residence. It was no longer a venue for social power. It was no longer connected to the systems that had made it meaningful. It was a sequence of rooms that visitors moved through in approximately 30 minutes. The guides were trained to explain the house's history. They described the construction, the cost, the materials. They identified the architect, the original owners, the social context. They pointed out the sienna marble, the bronze reliefs, the ceiling paintings. The narration was factual, but it could not reconstruct the function. The house had been designed to compel recognition, to enforce exclusivity, to demonstrate that the Vanderbilts commanded resources on a scale that could not be ignored. None of that could be conveyed to visitors who paid $1 to walk through rooms that anyone could now enter. The exclusivity had been the point. Without it, the house was simply expensive. The conversion required adjustments. Velvet ropes were installed to prevent visitors from touching surfaces. Plexiglass barriers protected furniture. The floors, which had been maintained for private use, now had to withstand thousands of footsteps each week. Lighting was upgraded to allow photography. Restrooms were added in the basement. The changes were minimal, but they altered the house's relationship to itself. It was no longer being maintained for the people who occupied it. It was being maintained for the people who observed it. The distinction was subtle, but it was total. The Preservation Society marketed Marble House as a window into the Gilded Age, a relic of an era when American wealth had been concentrated in ways that were no longer possible or acceptable. The marketing was accurate, but it was also reductive. The house was presented as evidence of excess, of decadence, of a social system that had collapsed under its own weight. The narrative was not wrong, but it flattened the house into a symbol. It eliminated the complexity, the strategy, the calculation, the specific pressures that had made the house necessary in 1892. Visitors were told what the house had cost, but not what it had accomplished. They were shown the ballroom, but not the mechanisms that had made the ballroom powerful. The house became part of a circuit. Visitors who came to Newport toured multiple estates in a single day. They started at the Breakers, moved to Marble House, continued to Rosecliff or the Elms. Each house was presented as a variation on the same theme: gilded excess, architectural ambition, the rise and fall of American industrial dynasties. The repetition was efficient, but it erased the distinctions. Marble House had been built to solve a specific problem: exclusion from a social system controlled by families who refused to recognize new wealth. The Breakers had been built for different reasons, by a different branch of the family, with different objectives. But in the museum context, the differences collapsed. The houses became interchangeable examples of a single phenomenon. The conversion also required the Preservation Society to make decisions about what to preserve and what to omit. The service corridors, the staff quarters, the kitchens, these were not included in the public tour. Visitors saw only the performance spaces, the rooms where guests had been received, where dinners had been served, where power had been displayed. The infrastructure that had made those performances possible was hidden. The house was presented as though it had operated automatically, as though the perfection had been effortless. The labor, the hierarchies, the systems of control, these were not part of the narrative. The house was preserved as a monument to wealth, but not as a document of how that wealth had been deployed. The tourism model also introduced pressures the house had never been designed to withstand. During the operational years, Marble House had been occupied for 3 months each summer by a family and a staff of 36. Now it was open to the public year-round, hosting tens of thousands of visitors annually. The marble floors wore down. The bronze fixtures required more frequent polishing. The painted ceilings were exposed to humidity fluctuations that had been controlled when the house was privately maintained. The Preservation Society invested in climate control, lighting systems, and security infrastructure. But the interventions were reactive. The house had not been built to be a museum. It was being retrofitted into one. The revenue from admissions helped fund maintenance, but it was not sufficient to cover the full cost of preservation. The Preservation Society relied on donations, grants, and endowment income to supplement ticket sales. The house, which had been built as an expression of private wealth, was now dependent on public and philanthropic support to remain standing. The irony was structural. The Vanderbilts had built Marble House to demonstrate financial independence, to prove that they did not need recognition from anyone. Now the house survived only because organizations and individuals who had no connection to the family chose to fund its preservation. Something essential had been lost in the conversion. The house was intact, the rooms were preserved, the surfaces were maintained, but the function was gone. Marble House had been designed to operate within a specific system, a social hierarchy controlled by exclusion, recognition, and the strategic deployment of capital. That system no longer existed. The families who had controlled it were gone, dispersed, or irrelevant. The rules had changed. The institutions that had made Marble House powerful, the social networks, the summer season, the competition for visibility, had dissolved. The house remained, but it was no longer connected to anything that gave it meaning beyond its own preservation. The museum narrative tried to fill this gap by contextualizing the house within the broader history of the Gilded Age. Visitors were told about industrialization, labor conditions, income inequality, and the social dynamics of late 19th century America. The information was accurate, but it was external to the house. It explained the conditions that produced Marble House, but it could not explain what the house had been designed to do. The house had not been built to reflect the Gilded Age. It had been built to navigate it, to compel outcomes, to enforce terms. The museum could preserve the structure, but it could not preserve the agency. By the 1970s, Marble House had been a museum longer than it had been a private residence. The visitors who tour, it had no memory of the social system it had been built to navigate. They saw the house as a historical artifact, a relic of a distant era, evidence of wealth and excess, but not of strategy or function. The house had become what it had been designed to resist, a monument to the past rather than an instrument of the present. The conversion had saved the structure, but it had also completed the process that had begun decades earlier. Marble House was no longer part of any living system. It was a document, and documents, no matter how carefully preserved, cannot perform the functions they were originally designed to execute. The house survived, but survival was not the same as continuity. Marble House receives approximately 100,000 visitors each year. They arrive by car, by tour bus, in groups organized by schools or travel agencies. They buy tickets at the entrance, receive a map of the grounds, and move through the house along a prescribed route. The tour takes 30 minutes. The rooms are roped off. The surfaces are protected. Photography is permitted, but touching is not. The visitors leave through the same door they entered, walk past the Chinese tea house, and return to their vehicles. Most will visit another estate before the day ends. Few will remember which rooms belong to which house. The house looks as it did in 1892. The marble is white, the bronze is polished. The ceiling in the ballroom still depicts open sky. The Gothic room still contains the medieval artifacts Alva purchased from European estates. The dining room still has rose marble columns. The furniture is original or period appropriate where the original pieces were sold or damaged. The Preservation Society has maintained the interiors with care, consulting historical records, photographs, and architectural drawings to ensure accuracy. The house is intact, but intact is not the same as functional. The visitors see a building. They do not see the system the building was designed to operate within. They do not see the social hierarchy that made exclusivity valuable, the summer season that compressed competition into 12 weeks, the families who controlled access to institutions that conferred legitimacy. They do not see Alva standing in the ballroom, directing conversation, managing guest lists, enforcing loyalty. They see empty rooms, expensive finishes, and explanatory plaques. The context that made the house legible, the pressures, the calculations, the specific mechanisms of power, exists only in the narration provided by guides or audio recordings. And narration cannot reconstruct function. The house is no longer connected to wealth. The Vanderbilt fortune that built it has been dispersed across dozens of heirs, eroded by taxes, divided by inheritance, and spent into irrelevance. No contemporary Vanderbilt commands the kind of concentrated capital that Cornelius or William Henry controlled. The family name is recognizable, but it no longer signifies power. It signifies history. The house itself generates no wealth. It is maintained by a nonprofit organization, funded through admissions, donations, and grants. The building that was constructed to demonstrate financial dominance now depends on public support to prevent decay. The society the house was designed to dominate no longer exists in the same form. The families who controlled New York society in the 1890s, the Astors, the Livingstons, the Schermerhorns, have either dispersed or lost the authority they once held. The mechanisms that enforced social hierarchy, the restricted guest lists, the opera boxes, the seasonal rituals, have been replaced by systems that operate on different principles. Wealth still confers status, But the relationship between wealth and legitimacy is no longer mediated through architecture and exclusivity in the way it was during the Gilded Age. The competition for visibility still exists, but it occurs in different arenas, using different tools with different rules. Newport itself has changed. The city is no longer a proving ground for American elites. It is a tourist destination. The estates that line Bellevue Avenue are museums, not residences. The summer season, which once brought the wealthiest families in America to the city for 3 months, now brings visitors who stay for a weekend, tour the houses, and leave. The economy depends on this traffic. The preservation of the estates is not cultural. It is commercial. The houses survive because they generate revenue, not because they hold power. Marble House endures because it was built well. The marble does not decay easily. The bronze can be polished, the structure is sound. But durability is not meaning. The house was designed to compel recognition, to enforce terms, to demonstrate that the Vanderbilts belonged at the center of American society. It succeeded. But the success was temporary. The recognition was granted. The terms were enforced, and then the conditions that made those outcomes necessary changed. The house remained, but the function dissolved. What remains is evidence. Marble House proves that American industrial wealth, at its peak, could produce monuments that rivaled the palaces of European aristocracy in scale, craftsmanship, and visual authority. It proves that new money could purchase the appearance of old power, that exclusivity could be manufactured through architecture and expenditure, that recognition could be compelled through strategic deployment of capital. But it also proves that none of this was sustainable. The house was built to signal permanence, but the fortune that built it was finite. The system it was designed to navigate was contingent, and the authority it generated was personal, not institutional. The visitors who walk through Marble House see the achievement but not the limits. They see the marble, the gold leaf, the imported stone. They see the ballroom where Alva once stood, controlling the flow of conversation and dictating the terms of inclusion. But they do not see the mechanisms that made that control possible, or the fragility of those mechanisms, or the fact that the control lasted less than a decade before the conditions beneath it began to erode. The house is presented as a monument to wealth. It is also a monument to the failure of wealth to replicate the structures that sustained European aristocracy across centuries. The European estates that Marble House was modeled after, Versailles, Chatsworth, Blenheim, survived because they were protected by law. Entail prevented estates from being sold or divided. Primogeniture ensured that inheritance passed intact to a single heir. Hereditary titles preserved family identity even when the wealth behind them diminished. These mechanisms were designed to insulate estates from the market forces that eventually dismantled the Vanderbilt fortune. American wealth had no such protections. It could be earned, divided, taxed, and spent, and without legal structures to prevent erosion, erosion was inevitable. Marble House was an attempt to overcome this structural disadvantage through visibility and expenditure. It succeeded in the short term. It forced Mrs. Astor to attend a ball. It positioned the Vanderbilts at the center of Newport society. It facilitated the marriage of Consuelo to the Duke of Marlborough. But these were tactical victories, not systemic ones. The house could compel recognition, but it could not create the legal or institutional frameworks that would have made that recognition durable. It could mimic aristocracy, but it could not replicate the mechanisms that made aristocracy resilient. The house now exists as a document of that limitation. It stands as proof that American industrial wealth could produce extraordinary things, buildings, collections, social networks, but could not produce the systems necessary to sustain them across generations. The Vanderbilts built Marble House. They did not build institutions that would protect it from the pressures of taxation, inheritance, and generational diffusion. And without those institutions, the house became what it is now. A structure maintained by people who have no connection to the family that built it, visited by people who have no memory of the system It was designed to operate within, preserved not because it holds power, but because it generates revenue. There is no tragedy in this. The house was always a tool, and tools become obsolete. The system it was designed to navigate collapsed not because it was flawed in some abstract sense, but because it was built on conditions that changed. The concentration of wealth that made Marble House possible was disrupted by tax policy, inheritance law, and the diffusion of capital across multiple heirs. The social hierarchy the house was designed to dominate fragmented as new sources of legitimacy emerged, and old gatekeepers lost their authority. The house did what it was built to do. It succeeded. And then the conditions that made its success meaningful disappeared. What remains is the building, the marble, the bronze, the gilded surfaces, the rooms where Alva stood, where guests were received, where the performance of aristocracy was executed with precision and expense. The structure is preserved, maintained, protected from decay. But the preservation is formal, not functional. The house cannot perform the role it was designed for because the role no longer exists. It cannot compel recognition because there is no system of exclusivity to compel recognition within. It cannot enforce terms because there are no terms to enforce. Marble House endures as a monument to arrival. It proves that the Vanderbilts arrived, that they forced their way into a system that had excluded them, that they commanded resources on a scale that could not be ignored. But arrival was not permanence. The house was built to signal that the Vanderbilts belonged. It did not build the structures that would have allowed them to stay. And so the house survives, visited by people who will never be excluded from it, maintained by organizations that have no stake in the power it once represented, standing as evidence that American industrial wealth could build monuments but could not build dynasties. The house is here. The system that gave it meaning is not.